Controversy still dogs the Philippines election, but there's no doubting who will be the next president after Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos's runaway victory. Now, the speed and depth of the triumph sparked protests in the capital. The return of the Marcos dynasty to the highest office in the land, triggering concerns about the family's notorious past. With 98% of eligible ballots counted, an unofficial tally shows Ferdinand Marcos Jr. with 31 million votes. That's double that of his nearest rival, Leni Robredo.
Any endeavor as large as this does not involve one person. It involves very, very many people working in very, very many different ways. And to all of them, I thank you.
And with that, another Marcos prepares to assume the Philippine presidency. Currently leading with a gap of at least 16 million votes, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., son and namesake of the late dictator, has successfully returned his family to power. Even several petitions against his presidential run are no longer in the way. A day after the polls, election officials dismissed all petitions to disqualify Marcos for tax evasion, for which he had been convicted. But there are still bumps on Marcos's way to the presidential palace. Protests have erupted in the capital, with hundreds decrying election irregularities.
People here have not conceded. I don't think they will ever concede. They're here to express a deep sense of outrage over the political system in the Philippines, which has allowed the heir of the dictator Marcos to return to power as president.
Madumi na yung laban because of historical revisionism and blatant lies, put forward to the people, So nandito tayo ngayon, para iprotesta, na lumabas ang COMELEC, at ilantad yung pahayag nila tungkol sa mga blatant lies, blatant violations to the election that are happening across the country.
Protesters are pointing to the fastest transmission of votes since 2010, as well as the consistent gap in the votes for Mr. Marcos and Ms. Robredo. The election body puts these down to upgraded equipment and systems, as well as the speedy transmission of results from various areas in the country, not just vote-rich provinces. At least one of Mr. Marcos's opponents has conceded. Manila Mayor Francisco Isko Moreno Domagoso has congratulated the frontrunner and asked his supporters to stand by the incoming administration. Leni Robredo, trailing far behind in second place, appealed for cooler heads and acceptance.
Hindi pwedeng maging ugat pa ng pagkakawatak-watak ang pagmamahal na ito. Bagaman may hindi pa nabibilang, bagaman may mga tanong paukol sa eleksyon na ito na kailangan matugunan, palinaw na ng palinaw ang tinig ng taong bayan. Sa ngalan ng Pilipinas na alam kong mahal na mahal rin ninyo, kailangan nating pakinggan ang tinig na ito dahil sa huli, iisa lang ang bayang pinagsasaluhan natin.
That acceptance would come easy for the Marcos family and their supporters. He would be the first president to win by a clear majority since 1986. The same year, the Marcos family fled the Philippines after his father's 21-year reign.
For more, Buena Bernal joins us live now from Manila. Buena, the official results, they usually take weeks, but we are already seeing some very compelling numbers for Marcos Jr. Is a Marcos victory set in stone?
Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the late dictator's son, is presumed to be the next president of the Philippines based on unofficial partial results directly from the Election Commission's transparency server. And this is an unprecedented majority vote. That's the first time since 1986 when his father, late dictator Ferdinand E. Marcos Sr., was ousted after his 21-year regime, 14 years of which were under martial law, where we saw Congress dissolved. He jailed oppositionists. He seized private companies for his cronies to monopolize, causing the Philippines' worst recession at that time. And this win is highly riding on a vicious rebranding of their family name, as well as alliances with the political elites in this country. That includes the presidential daughter, Sara Duterte, also presumed to be the next vice president of the Philippines, and also his alliances with two former Philippine presidents. One, Madam Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and two, Mr. Erupt Estrada, who led the country in corruption-mired presidencies. Mrs. Arroyo has been indicted but acquitted of plunder, and Mr. Estrada has been convicted but pardoned of plunder. It was Mrs. Arroyo who pardoned Mr. Estrada. So this is the alliance that gave way to this victory. This election is seen as a referendum on the Filipino people's idea and understanding of its history, as well as a test on their belief in democracy, showing a seeming preference for strongman rule.
Well, Buena, there's celebration and there's also disappointment depending on who the voters backed. But what is sentiment on the ground like with all of these mixed reactions?
A local coalition of martial law victims called Karma, or the Campaign Against the Return of Marcoses and Martial Law, are saying that Mr. Marcos Jr. cheated his way to victory based on historical distortions and misrepresentations. Vice President Leni Robredo and her running mate, Kiko Pangilinan, for the vice presidential race have yet to concede, which speaks volumes about how they take seriously these allegations of fraud. However, their statement fell short of actually affirming these allegations and saying that they will seek the advice of academics and experts on the matter. But the anxiety of martial law victims and those who experience the atrocities of the Marcos regime is really about their trauma being relieved, with thousands tortured, jailed at that time. And, they say, however, that there are rights groups who look at this Marcos Jr. presidency, or that possibility of him being the next president, being the front runner by a commanding lead in the unofficial results, as something that strengthens their resolve to still preserve democratic ideals in the Philippines. And you can see, for example, these volunteers behind me volunteering for a local election watchdog for the manual parallel count of the automated elections, showing you that young people are offering their time and resources to ensure the sanctity of the ballot, and still believes in Southeast Asia's oldest democracy.
Buena, thank you for that. Buena Bernal there in Manila.